Hello, everybody. Hello, hello, hello. My name is Melanie. This is Adventures in Hostessville, and welcome to episode 16 of the Vintage Magazine Project and the fourth week of the 1913 Modern Priscilla. Ba-da-bum, ba-dum-bum, bum, ba-da-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So this week's article is The Home Dressmaker for the Trousseau. So most of the articles in this magazine about sewing clothes, of which there are many, want you to send in to Modern Priscilla to buy the pattern, which I obviously can't do. So I picked this one because really what they're saying is you can take an old pattern, just any basic dress pattern, and sort of adjust it. The biggest piece of fabric I had was this white stuff. So instead of making a full dress, I am going to make a shirtwaist. So shirtwaists are basically what people are calling blouses. And by 1913, they're pretty ubiquitous. Pretty much every clothing article in this magazine has either a pattern you can send in for a shirtwaist, or you can just buy them ready-made. As a matter of fact, if you have heard the word shirtwaist, it's probably because of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire that happened in March of 1911. But by 1913, when this magazine comes out, the effects are still being felt. All right, so if you don't know about the Shirtwaist Factory fire, or if you're like, yeah, I heard about it probably in junior high, can I have a refresher? Here's the basics. The guys who ran it were named Harris and Blanc, and they were known as the Shirtwaist Kings because they had made so much money with this shirtwaist factory. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was on the 8th through 10th floors. So the fire breaks out at a little bit before 5 o'clock, and 18 minutes later, it's done. And 146 people are dead. There were basically zero safety measures in place. There were no sprinklers, there was no fire door, there were no firewalls. Some of the doors to get out had been locked because they didn't want people stealing things. The entire place is filled with these like baskets of cotton scraps that they would just throw in, and they kept piling up, piling up, and piling up. There are hundreds and hundreds of people in there. There are hundreds of sewing machines on each floor. Nobody can get to the doors. Nobody can get out. The fire escape isn't up to code. People get on it and it like collapses. People are falling to their death from this fire escape. A lot of people actually end up jumping from the windows. They're trying to catch them with their nets, but from that distance, they just break through the net. It's awful. It is not that people didn't know that conditions in the factories were really bad. And one of the reasons that they did know is that there had been a huge strike in the winter of 1909 into 1910 that came to be known as the Uprising of the 20,000, which should indicate that it was not small and quiet. And I think that's another one of the myths of the Shirtwaist Factory fire, is that people feel like all of the people that worked at these factories were these young, sort of helpless immigrant girls who didn't speak English and couldn't protect themselves or fight for their rights or anything like that. And that's not really true. It is true that a really large percentage of the workers were young immigrant girls. There were some men that worked in these factories, particularly as cutters, so basically doing this. This was one of the higher paid jobs, so of course it went to men. But the vast majority of the employees at these factories were women, and they were largely young. The average age, I think, of these shirtwaist factory workers was between 15 and 23. Legally, they could hire workers as young as 13. But the women are also largely immigrants. When this happens, there are tons of thousands of women working in shirtwaist factories in New York, and half of them are Jewish, most of them immigrants from Eastern Europe. Another third of them are Italian, and then there's a smattering, of all sorts of other people. And this really plays into the but they're not helpless thing, because these women, specifically the Jewish women from Eastern Europe, come from this culture of organizing. And another thing that is very common within those communities is membership in the Socialist Party. So the Socialist Party is pretty mainstream at this point, but really along class lines. The Socialists are very involved in a lot of these trade unions that are also springing up. So the International Ladies Garment Workers Union is formed, I think, in 1900. You've also, at this point, got the International Workers of the World, which is the really sort of left-wing socialist one. And then you've got the AFL, which is less so. This strike happens in, I think, November of 1909, and they strike for the better part of 3 months. Some factories settle earlier, so people go back to work earlier. Triangle is not one of them. So what they decide to do is they hire a bunch of sex workers, or prostitutes in the terms of the day, to attack the picketing women. And then when the picketing women defend themselves a bit against them, they call the cops and get them arrested on assault charges. Classy. But in general, it is considered to be a successful strike. A lot of the things they'd asked for, they did get. Like, they got a reduction in the work week to 52 hours. They got so that they were not required to provide their own thread and pins. So this fire happens at the Shirtwaist factory in Newark, New Jersey in November of 1910. 25 people die in it. And here's the thing. At this point in time, people die at work all of the time. Not just in these garment factories, but the textile industry is very dangerous. Mining is a disaster. Every day, workers are dying on the job. So this 25 people dying is not insignificant. So when it's only 4 months until the Triangle factory fire happens, people are like, when does it stop, right? Enough. Hold on one second. I don't think I can talk over the sewing machine. Okay, where there were 3 pieces, now there is 1. So I will put the trim over the top of these seams now. I don't remember where I was in the story. Outrage, I think. Yes. So 1 week after the fire, on April 2nd of 1911, there's an emergency meeting of the Women's Trade Union League. And this organization is kind of a curious thing because it's got the word union in it, but it is not a union. It is a benevolent, charitable society. And they actually, it's largely financial, but they also were really instrumental in the 1909 strike in bringing attention to it and getting sympathy to the side of the strikers. So they are useful. And in 1909, when they're working with that, Rose Schneiderman is working with them as well. So this organization is kind of this weird amalgamation of these rich women and then also these actual workers, because these women don't work. They're not, their husbands work, and their husbands are, in a lot of cases, probably a large part of the problem, but they don't know anything about how all this stuff works. So they actually do have to work with actual workers and organizers and socialists, and Rose Schneiderman is part of it. So they throw this meeting. They throw it at the Metropolitan Opera House. 3,500 people show up to this meeting. They are going to take up a fund to send money to the victims' families, which it's not nothing. I mean, a lot of these girls are the breadwinners for their families. It's not addressing the cause of the problem. So Rose Schneiderman, immigrant from Eastern Europe, socialist, worker, organizer, gets up in front of all these rich women and she says, I would be a traitor to these poor burned bodies if I came here to talk good fellowship. We have tried you good people of the public, and we have found you wanting. This is not the first time girls have been burnt alive in the city. Every week I must learn of the untimely death of one of my sister workers. Every year thousands of us are maimed. The life of men and women is so cheap, and property is so sacred. We have tried you, citizens. We are trying you now, and you have a couple of dollars for the sorrowing mothers, brothers, and sisters by way of a charity gift. But every time the workers come out in the only way they know to protest against conditions which are unbearable, the strong hand of the law is allowed to press down heavily upon us. Public officials have only words of warning for us, warning that we must be intensely peaceable. The strong hand of the law beats us back when we rise into the conditions that make life unbearable. I can't talk fellowship to you who are gathered here. Too much blood has been spilled. I know from my experience it is up to the working people to save themselves. Okay, well, I've got it into sort of a smock thing so far. It took me a lot longer than it should have because I am not a very good seamstress and wouldn't survive for a moment as a worker in a garment factory, which is probably fair because as much as I wish I was Rose Schneiderman in this world, I think I'm probably actually the women that she's talking to, but not even rich. But that's a thing for me to work on. And another thing for me to work on is setting in the sleeves. I've done a lot of stuff to kind of try and 1913 it up a little bit by adding the trim in different places and changing the scale of the collar and stuff like that. And now I'm gonna try and make these sleeves not be super duper puffy. The good news is that actual change did happen after the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire. A factory investigation committee was formed within New York, all sorts of new regulations. But as for justice, you know, Harris and Blanc are actually indicted for, I think, second-degree manslaughter and gross negligence, I think is what it is. But they're acquitted. Hold on. Right side to right side. Something has to be on the right side. What? Yeah? Yeah. So in this case, it all came down to that one locked door. What the prosecution had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt in this case is that one door was locked, that fewer people would have died if it hadn't been locked, and that Harris and Blanc knew it was locked. And that last one is the kicker. How do you prove that? And so they're acquitted. There is a civil suit in 1913 that is settled in 1914. Harris and Blanc do end up having to pay, I think it's $75 per victim. But they also got an insurance payout for the fire that came to like $400 a victim. So they're fine. You know, and it wouldn't even be so bad if it seemed like they learned their lesson. But in 1913, right around the time that this magazine is advertising shirtwaists from shirtwaist factories, Blanc gets an inspection violation for having the doors of his factory locked. And you'd think, you know, it'd be like, well, but this is your second strike, and last time on your first strike, 146 people died, so you'd think that would play in. It doesn't. They give him the minimum fine, so he ends up paying $20. It'd be fun if the world wasn't still like that. Okay, it's a shirt. But I want to put some decorative buttons on it as well because that is the main design feature of the dress that I'm not making from the Trousseau article. So Blanc and Harris don't really have to pay for the fire at their factory at all. But a lot of changes are made and workplaces do get a lot safer. And Rose Schneiderman ends up doing a ton of things, working a lot more in labor and working in suffrage and all of that sort of thing. But she also becomes friends with Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt and becomes one of their chief advisors when Roosevelt's in the White House on working conditions and labor issues and that sort of thing. Here it is, my shirtwaist. It is all done. I think it turned out pretty good. If you don't look at the back, I feel like Anne of Green Gables and Marian the Librarian, and when it's untucked, I sort of look like Jerry the dentist from the Bob Newhart show. So it's a win-win-win. So do all this stuff. Subscribe on YouTube, follow me on Facebook and Instagram. You can subscribe on Patreon if you want, or just take in the glory of my beautiful shirtwaist. Oh, are you kidding me? It's supposed to go in between the laces.